my computer.
So it's forward and back?
Yeah. I'll try it. And then,
And then
Sounds like a very appropriate representation of nothingness.
Exactly. Okay, all right. You've got the after lunch slot. We're all.
well, I know you're all going to sleep on me.
So you know, if you hear snoring.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Next up, we have Ken Parry.
Well, there's three things I want to say first. The first is I'd like to acknowledge the Gundagora and Daru people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Second thing is to thank Dean for organising such a fantastic conference and to invite me to speak. I think it's been a wonderful event and such a interdisciplinary event that I don't think I've attended anything quite like it before, so it really is very good, and thank you very much. The third thing is, I have a few slides, but unfortunately I didn't have enough time to put all my quotations on slides, so you'll have to bear with me as I read them out. So here are the two guys we're talking about, Meister Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa. You can see Meister Eckhart dressed in black because he was a Dominican, and we've got Nicholas wearing his red, or not wearing his red cardinal hat to signify their status. So I've selected two themes to examine in Meister Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa: Apophaticism, or negation, and Deification, or godlikeness. It is my intention to not my intention to suggest that these two themes exhaust the depth of thought in these two authors, but rather to highlight them in the broader context of understanding their contribution to the conference topic. Besides, in this presentation, I can only scratch the surface. The two are characteristic of both theologians, but are not always discussed together, with Apophaticism taking the lion's share of the commentary. While it is an essential element of their theological thinking, Apophaticism needs to be discussed and understood in relation to that of deification, which in our thinkers is the ultimate destination of the apophatic way. The terminology of both these ideas originates in the ancient world, with passages from the Judeo-Christian scriptures used to endorse them. The traditional pairing of the two emerges in the writings of several early Christian authors, and Apophaticism, mediated through later Platonism, had a lasting impact on all three Abrahamic faiths. So we'll begin with some general remarks related to Apophaticism and deification. Before we do that, however, we should say something about the term Neoplatonism, which is often mentioned in relation to our two thinkers. When we refer to this term, we have in mind those philosophers who from the 3rd to the 6th century CE developed a particular form of Platonism that became persuasive during this period. The term Neoplatonism is a modern term applied to the philosophy of Plotinus in the 3rd century, who developed a far-reaching metaphysical and religious interpretation of Plato's works. He was followed by his pupil, Porphyry, who in turn was followed by a succession of other thinkers, notably Proclus in the 5th century. Although we might call them Neoplatonists or New Platonists, a title they would have repudiated, they were not simply Platonistic, but took ideas from other schools of philosophy. One of the characteristics of their enterprise was writing commentaries on the works of Aristotle as well as those of Plato. This was often done with the intention of harmonizing them. By the time we come to the 14th and 15th centuries in the West, so-called Christian Platonism had filtered through into mainstream theology. It was characterized by emphasis on the one, the ultimate being, the transcendent but unknowable source of all things. The Neoplatonic trinity of the one, intellect and soul, was to some extent assimilated into the Christian trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Although Eckhart and Cusa were aware of the new Aristotelianism, mediated through the Arabs, they adhered largely to the Christian Platonism initiated by the 9th century Irishman John Scotus Eriugena and his translation of the Christian Platonist Dionysius the Areopagite. So I'll say something first about the Greek background to the idea of apophaticism. At its most basic, apophasis is the use of the alpha privative to negate a positive word in Greek. The following from John of Damascus in the 8th century is a good example of this rudimentary method. John gives a list of negative attributes descriptive of God, each beginning with the alpha privative. So here's John of Damascus, 8th century. John of Damascus was a Chalcedonian living in Syria in the 8th century, wearing his keffiyeh because he's an Arab Christian. And you can see there how he lists the negative attributes descriptive of God. Of course, in English, we can apply a variety of prefixes to negate a word, but in Greek, the alpha privative will do this for us. In addition to this grammatical usage, the use of using negation to explore abstract and metaphysical ideas is to be found, of course, in the writings of Plato, notably in his Parmenides, in which the mention of being and non-being is discussed. Apophaticism in Eckhart and Cusa relates primarily to its theological function. It is with the Middle Platonists of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE that apophatism becomes an intellectual tool in metaphysics and theology. It was particularly influential at that time on Christians of the Alexandrian school, notably Clement and Origen of Alexandria, as well as the Jewish thinker Philo of Alexandria. Plato promoted Socratic ignorance, a state of philosophical being, based on a remark attributed to Socrates, who said, "I know only one thing, that I know nothing." Here, ignorance is made the beginning of wisdom, the wisdom of unknowing, which is probably where the phrase learned ignorance, Dr. Ignorantia, comes from in Augustine and later in Nicholas of Cusa, especially in his work with that title published in 1440. The main representative of the apophatic way for our thinkers is Dionysius the Areopagite, the late 5th, early 6th century author known today as Pseudo-Dionysius, whose name is mentioned by Paul in Acts 17:34. This was when the apostle was in Athens discussing with philosophers the dedication of an altar to the unknown God, indicating divine unknowability, but appropriated by Paul for the Christian God. Dionysius' toponym refers to the Areopagus outcrop on the Acropolis in Athens, where the law council used to meet. He is called Pseudo-Dionysius because the unknown author hid his identity behind this 1st century name, and this was undoubtedly done to give his work apostolic prestige. The Corpus Dionysiacum consists of 4 theological works, of which the shortest, the mystical theology, was the most popular. Now, I don't like the translation mystical theology. I think mysterious or mystery is a better translation of the Greek, but we all know it as the mystical theology. I think mysterious is a better translation here. It was written in Greek in a Syrian environment and translated into several Eastern Christian languages, such as Syriac and Armenian, before it was translated into Latin. It was the translation of John Scotus, along with his translation of the 7th century Greek theologian Maximus the Confessor, that brought Dionysius and the apophatic tradition to the attention of the West. John Scotus himself wrote a work called Periphysion, or the Division of Nature, which is a precursor to the Christian Neoplatonism of our authors, particularly Cusa, who annotated a manuscript copy of this work. We can see the tone set by Scotus from the following quotation. I quote, "We do not know what God is. God himself does not know what he is because he is not anything. Literally, God is not because he transcends being." So already here in the 9th century into the Latin, we have this apophatic tradition entering into the Western Christian tradition. Although the authenticity of the Dionysian corpus was questioned very early in Constantinople in 535, so this is not long after this work was first put out, on the basis that there was no previous mention of a Christian author by this name, so it was questioned early. Ultimately, it did not matter that the corpus was not what it pretended to be. Indeed, Maximus the Confessor, who was prepared to ignore the anachronisms and to accept the corpus as the inspired writings of an author utilizing both Apophaticism and Deification, referring to him as the divine Dionysius. Now, Dionysius is the most quoted authority of Thomas Aquinas after Augustine, and the inspiration for the anonymous author of the 14th century, Cloud of Unknowing, which you'll be familiar with, I'm sure. In the West, Lorenzo Vala's remarks of 1457 concerning the pseudonymity of the corpus were rather late in the day, with Cusa himself already expressing his doubts about its dating, perhaps through his discussions with Greeks during his visit to Constantinople in 1437. Such was the interest in authenticating Dionysius as a true Christian voice that it was claimed his Neoplatonic contemporary and head of the school of Athens, Proclus, had stolen his ideas from Dionysius. This is very interesting. This reversal of the historical chronology was a neat piece of Christian propaganda intended to silence suspicions surrounding the identity and dating of the corpus. This can be seen in a passage attributed to Maximus the Confessor. I quote, "One should know that some pagan thinkers, and especially Proclus, often employ ideas and even entire expressions taken from the blessed Dionysius. One may suspect that they took them from him, since the more ancient philosophers in Athens appropriated and hid his material, so that they would appear as the authors of his divine works." I mean, this is quite incredible what we've got going on here. So it was Dionysius, through Proclus, that the Neoplatonic thought found its way into Christian speculative theology in a lasting and meaningful way. By the time we come to Eckhart and Cusa, they are reading the Areopagite through several layers of historical exegesis. Anticipating Dionysius in several ways, Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century says that the mind needs to leave behind all sense perceptions and intellectual concepts in seeking the unseen and incomprehensible God. I quote, "For it is precisely in this that true knowledge of what is sought consists, and precisely in this that seeing consists, that is, in not seeing, because we seek what lies beyond all knowledge, shrouded by incomprehensibility in all directions, as it were by some cloud." And of course, mention of the cloud is a reference to Exodus 24:15, where Moses enters a cloud to speak with the unseen God. So the cloud becomes a common metaphor for the unknowability of God, hence the title Cloud of Unknowing mentioned already. Dionysius, in discussing what can be confirmed about the cause of all beings, suggests that it is more appropriate to negate all affirmations since it surpasses all being. I quote, maybe we've got the slide here. No, we haven't. We've got the earlier one from John Scotus, so there you can see him there. So Dionysius says, "Now we should not conclude that the negations are simply the opposite of the affirmations, but rather that the cause of all is considerably prior to this, beyond privations, beyond every denial, beyond every assertion." So there is Dionysius. What lies beyond every denial and every assertion is what Eckhart, following Dionysius, calls the negation beyond negation. That is, the hyper-negation or super-essential God. The resulting silence, unknowing, and ignorance must be recognized as the ultimate state in which to contemplate the divine. We can see the role Dionysius played in Cusa's thinking in the opening section of his treatise On God as Not Other. It begins with 3 of his students telling him what they are studying. The first is studying Plato's Parmenides and Proclus's commentary on it. The second is studying Proclus's Platonic theology and translating it into Latin. The third is studying Aristotle, while Nicholas himself is studying Dionysius. This sets the scene for a conversation in which Nicholas praises Proclus and Aristotle, but describes Dionysius as taking things a stage further. Dionysius' promotion of a baptized Platonism provides Cusa with an intellectual bridge between Neoplatonism and Christianity. Now we need to say something about the background to this idea and adoption of deification. On several occasions, Plato defines philosophy as becoming godlike as far as is possible. Among the Neoplatonists, this became one of the standard definitions of philosophy, along with another definition of philosophy as a preparation for death. So, Chris, there's your built-in part of what you were saying. The latter was adopted by Christians as a monastic virtue stemming from a voluntary purification of the senses. Defining philosophy in this way as a preparation for death, right, was related to becoming godlike as far as is possible, because without self-denial and asceticism, there was no achieving godlikeness, whether by means of divine grace or without it. Although grace is not commonly associated with Neoplatonism, there is a sense of divine benevolence activating the philosopher. For Iamblichus in the 4th century, contemplation and prayer would seem to be the means by which we move to divinization. And I quote, he says, the consciousness of our own nothingness, if one judges it in comparison with the gods, makes us naturally turn to supplications. And by the practice of supplication, we are gradually raised to the level of the object of our supplication, and we gain likeness to it by virtue of our constant consorting with it, and starting from our own imperfection, we gradually take on the perfection of the divine. Iamblichus takes this a stage further when speaking about the participation of matter and created things in divinity because of the divine nature of the demiurge. And I quote him again. He says, and let there be no astonishment if in this connection we speak of a pure and divine form of matter. For matter also issues from the Father and Creator of all, and thus gains its perfection, which is suitable to the reception of gods. And at the same time, nothing hinders the superior beings from being able to illuminate their inferiors. For since it was proper not even for terrestrial things to be utterly deprived of participation in the divine, earth also has received from such participation a share in divinity. This is quite an extraordinary statement for a Neoplatonist to make. I don't think Plotinus would have done that, but certainly the later Platonists, like Iamblichus, are very much saying this. In this passage, the Neoplatonic notion of creation as a theophany, in which the divine participates in matter, may be compared, to some extent, with the Christian incarnational theology, in which creation is transformed through divinity uniting with humanity. Both traditions treat creation as fundamentally good, even though their views on the origin and purpose of creation may differ. Neither the Platonist demiurge nor the Christian creator God abandon their creations, because the universe continues to operate under the governance of divine providence, which we heard yesterday, I think. For both, that's Christian and Neoplatonists, evil is ultimately a privation and has no ontological status, and for which human freedom must take responsibility. In the Roman world, the idea of apotheosis applied to the transformation of a hero or emperor into a god. But in Christianity, Deification turns no one into a god. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, makes this clear. And what shall we say of the emperors who, when they die among yourselves, are always deemed worthy of deification, and you produce someone who swears he has seen the cremated Caesar ascending from the funeral pyre up into heaven? Justin uses the same word that is used in that quote for those who have lived a holy and virtuous life close to God. It is personal virtue, not senatorial decree, that confirms this status. The Christian distinction in vocabulary from the pagan tradition emerges with this term theosis in the Greek. Christian deification followed the dictum attributed to Athanasius of Alexandria in the 4th century, who said God became human so that humanity might become divine. Neither Neoplatonism nor Christianity suggests that deification means total absorption of the human into the divine. Such an occurrence would make us gods before our time. The path of virtue as a way of life was embraced by both traditions, and for Christians being made in the divine image and likeness, this was the key to understanding the deification process. That it was a process and not an event, a means to an end and not an end in itself, was made clear by Gregory of Nyssa, who called it unending. There's no end to this process. And it was progressive, not retrogressive. That is, it was not an attempt to restore humanity to its pristine condition before the fall. The question hinged on what was lost because of the fall. Was it both the image and the likeness? To a certain degree, East and West saw differently the implications for humankind. In the Greek tradition, the image was retained, but the likeness lost. While in the Latin tradition, particularly with Augustine, both image and likeness were lost, resulting in each being led down a different path. Nevertheless, in both cases, deification acted as a counterweight to Apophaticism, with negative theology providing the ultimate way to a positive experience. So we'll talk about Eckhart on detachment. Eckhart applies the apophatic way in his treatise on detachment. He praises detachment more than the virtues of love, humility, and mercy, yet he is not disparaging those virtues in any real sense. He places them on a lower level to that of detachment because none of them can be performed without it. Its nature is such that it becomes the instrument of all virtues. But what does he mean by detachment, especially when he says that it borders closely on nothing? He writes that God's own and natural place is unity and purity, which comes from detachment. So for us as humans to practice detachment brings us nearer to God. For him, detachment is receptive of nothing but God, remarking that detachment is so near nothingness that nothing is so delicate that it could remain in detachment except God alone. Eckhart is not, I don't think, equating nothingness with God, although we can argue this. I think this is so because the term nothingness no more signifies God than everythingness. And it would compromise his apophaticism, and I'm not saying that he's always logical about how he presents his material, by attributing a nothing, that is a something, to God, while also undermining divine transcendence. For God is neither nothing nor something, both terms being inapplicable. So detachment is a process of mind emptying, of which self-abasement and nihilism, thinking one is nothing, are part of it. For Eckhart, a soul in a state of pure detachment attracts itself to God. It is the nearest we come to being in a formless state. He sums it up thus: if a human being is to become like God, insofar as a creature can possess similarity to God, it must be by means of detachment. So the end of detachment is deification, with the proviso, and this is important, in as far as, which is a throwback, of course, to Plato's definition of philosophy as assimilation to God as far as is possible. Furthermore, this similarity or assimilation cannot happen without an experience of the divine presence. Only we need to understand what is meant by that. We should not expect the skies to open and the hand of divine grace to reach down to us with a supernatural blessing. Notice that in saying to become like God, Eckhart is indicating that deification is potential. It is becoming godlike, never actually being God. But we'll see something else in a minute. The in quantum qualifier, which means insofar as or in as much as, distances the creator from the creature, the universal from the particular, pointing to the inequality of the relationship between God and humanity. At the same time, Eckhart is rather scathing of those who lay emphasis on special dispensations to prove their closeness to God. He writes, "If a man thinks he will get more of God by inwardness, by devotion, by ecstasies, or by special infusions of grace, than by the fireside or in the stable, that is nothing but taking God, wrapping a cloak around his head, and shoving him under a bench. For whoever seeks God in a way, right, in a way, gets the way and misses God, who remains hidden in the way." I think is a wonderful quotation, isn't it? So we may think we're being rewarded for our devotion when we experience ecstatic states, but these may get in the way of what we're seeking. We should not desire such experiences for their own sake, but should put them aside and move on to the next stage. Eckhart's warning against mistaking the sideshow for the main event is one that echoes across the traditions anyway. And he goes on to say, "It is lamentable how some people think themselves so lofty and quite one with God. They are a long way from where they imagine themselves to be. They have great notions and desires to match. But I once said, if a man seeks nothing, to whom should he complain if he finds nothing?" So it's a wonderful one, Killer. He is critical too of those who boast about their spiritual achievements and think themselves a cut above the rest. He says, "We should not think that holiness is based on what we do, but rather on what we are. For it is not our works which sanctify us, but we who sanctify our works." So it's not the outward character of our actions that should concern us, but the ground or origin of them. If our intentions are good, then it follows that our actions will be good as well. So there is a strong ethical dimension to Eckhart's idea of detachment. It's not just an intellectual exercise, but an act of personal renunciation. It's an ongoing habit of introspection based on a daily routine to examine and confess one's conscience. Eckhart makes the following observation: "You should know that no one has ever renounced themselves so much in this life that there was nothing left of themselves to renounce." So I think you can see where Eckhart is on these issues. So he makes it clear that detachment also does not mean indifference. We should not remain insensitive to our surroundings, no matter our state of inner tranquility. He said it is wrong to think that in trying to be perfect, we need to overcome feelings of joy and sorrow. It is wrong because there is no seeker who has not felt emotion when trying to find God. He says that some claim they remain unaffected by things around them, but then remarks that he will never reach the point where a hideous noise is as pleasing to his ears as sweetly sounding music. So this is a very good statement about what not to be doing in terms of detachment and contemplation and so on. For Eckhart, all creatures seek to become godlike, due to a spark of divinity in the soul, which is the essence or ground that desires to be in communion with God. He uses the scholastic term synteresis, which is for him the disposition of the soul to apprehend the divine. However, the soul, in seeking this communion through apophatic detachment, may need to be rescued. He writes, "The soul falls into nothingness, and in that nothingness so far from the created something, that of its own powers it cannot return to the created something. God, in his uncreatedness, upholds its nothingness and preserves it in his something. The soul has dared to become nothing, and so cannot of itself return to itself, for it has departed so far from itself before God comes to the rescue. So you can see how he's thinking about where we're going with this apophatic detachment and contemplation. In wanting to become godlike, we are in fact asking to be sons and daughters of God. But how, asks Eckhart, can we be sons of God when God is not like anybody? And he says, since it is God's nature not to be like anyone, we have to come to the state of being nothing in order to enter into the same nature that he is. So when I'm able to establish myself in nothing and nothing in myself, uprooting and casting out what is in me, then I can pass into the native being of God. All that smacks of likeness must be ousted, that I may be transplanted into God and become one with him, one substance, one being, one nature, and the Son of God. And we'll come back to this one substance in a minute. He suggests that if someone is one with God and is God on the basis of that union, then it must be on that part of the image in which we are like him and not upon the created part. He is referring here, of course, to the image and likeness theme, with the uncreated part being the divine. He says, for when we consider someone as God, we do not consider them according to their creatureliness, but when we consider them as God, we're not denying their creatureliness in such a way as to negate it. Rather, this is to be seen as an affirmation of God, which denies creatureliness in him. Very interesting way that he's playing with that. He then quotes Augustine as saying, we are what we love. We love a stone, then we are a stone. If we love a person, then we are that person. If we love God, I hesitate to go on, says Augustine, for if I said that we would then be God, you might want to stone me. I think it's a very interesting observation he's making. He doesn't want to go too far here. So at this juncture, we might introduce Eckhart's statement that was condemned as Article 10 in the bull of Pope John the 12th, issued in 1329, not long after Eckhart's death. It is one of 28 articles condemned, of which the first 15 were declared heretical, and number 10 reads as follows. This is Eckhart, quoting from Eckhart. We're fully transformed and converted into God. In the same way as in the sacrament the bread is converted into the body of Christ, so I am converted into him. So that converts me into his being as one, not as like, Eckhart says, by the living God it is true that there is no difference. Now this is an extraordinary statement for a Christian to make. And you can see that this passage, why this passage called his orthodoxy into question. To claim that there's no difference between oneself and God and that we become the same as God. But note what he says. It is the not as like that's really of interest, because it is reminiscent of the like and same debate during an earlier controversy in the 4th century, the Arian controversy. This controversy centered on whether Christ was of a like substance to the Father or of the same substance, homoousios, as the Father. And this became embedded in the Nicene Creed as Christ being consubstantial with the Father. But here Eckhart is suggesting that humanity and divinity are homoousios, the same substance. He seems to be taking deification of the human nature in the person of Christ to include himself and potentially other Christians as well. The Eucharistic context for this bold statement would appear to give validity to the transubstantiating effect of deification. It's quite extraordinary what he said here, as I've tried to point out. It is of interest that Nicholas of Cusa, in his apology for his work on learned ignorance, writes of Eckhart. This is Cusa on Eckhart. He says, the teacher, that is Cusa, said that he'd never read that Eckhart thought that the creature was the creator and praised his talent and fervour. Yet he wished that his books would be removed from public places, for the people are not ready for what he often has to say, contrary to the custom of other learned men, even though the intelligent find in them many astute and useful things. So you can see that Cusa's, is betting both ways here on Eckhart. And he thinks he never said and should not have been condemned for saying what he said. So we turn to Nicholas of Cusa. Nicholas of Cusa's most famous work is his work on learned ignorance, written in 1440 after his visit to Constantinople in 1437 as a member of the delegation to win Greek support for the Pope's proposal for a Council of Unity in Italy. This was the Council of Ferrara, Florence of 1449, which failed in its objective just 4 years before the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. He appears to have spent his time in Constantinople looking for Greek manuscripts, including a copy of Pseudo-Dionysius and Proclus's Platonic theology. He appended a letter to Unlearned Ignorance explaining that the inspiration for it came to him while at sea for 2 months returning to Venice. I quote what he says: "Returning by sea from Greece, when by what I believe was a celestial gift from the Father of lights, from whom comes every perfect gift, I was led to embrace incomprehensibles incomprehensibly in learned ignorance, by transcending those incorruptible truths that can be humanly known." So he's giving us a context in which this idea occurred to him. In his apology for this work, written 9 years later in 1449, he notes that his discovery of learned ignorance came initially as a gift, which he then traced in earlier sources, notably Augustine, Dionysius, the Pseudo-Dionysius, Bonaventure, Thierry of Chartres, and Meister Eckhart. The work represents his first systematic attempt to explain the concepts of learned ignorance and coincidence of opposites, two ideas that he continued to develop throughout the rest of his life. The expression learned ignorance is Cusa's term for theological apophaticism. It is a lack of knowledge that paradoxically must be learnt, but which is also epistemic because it is an intellectual achievement. He sometimes refers to it as enlightened ignorance or sacred ignorance, being as much a gift as a pedagogical outcome. It is the ignorance that comes from knowing that one will never know the absolute nature of things, especially God. It echoes Anselm's famous ontological argument, and we had it quoted earlier, for God is a being that which nothing greater can be conceived. Although confirming God's existence, Anselm's argument places God out of reach of the human intellect and beyond anything that can be conceived in relation to him. What is denied is perhaps more important than what is affirmed. Learned ignorance is knowledge that is unknown because it is beyond being, affirming both its epistemological and ontological significance. Unlearned ignorance is divided into 3 parts: God, universe, and Christ. The harmonizing of opposites is a way of viewing theological and philosophical problems from the viewpoint of eternity, the subspecie eternitatis, rather than from the viewpoint of humanity. The fact of viewing human life under the aspect of eternity does not necessarily mean it is meaningless. On the contrary, it helps us to evaluate our lives and those of others and to determine the meaning we place upon ourselves and the rest of our species. Cusa finds in the idea of the coincidence of opposite what he needs to understand, that everything is one in God and that God is one in everything. It brings God into the world rather than him being separated from it. Cusa writes, I quote, "Theosis is the Greek name of God, but only as God is sought by humans in this world." Theosis is, so I go on, theosis is not itself the name of God then, because we do not know what name God calls himself. However, in Exodus 3:14 of the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of what we call the Old Testament, God calls himself by the abstract concept in Greek, the being. This translation reflects the ancient Jewish reluctance to pronounce the sacred name of God by substituting the tetragrammaton representing the 4 Hebrew consonants of Yahweh. Cusa knows and refers to this tradition most probably via Maimonides when he writes, God's proper name, which we say is ineffable and which is a tetragrammaton, that is, consisting of 4 letters, is proper to God because it applies to God according to God's own essence and not through any relation to creatures. Now, the use of the Greek philosophical concept, the being, is discussed by Pseudo-Dionysius in his work on the divine names, where he locates its primary position in the hierarchy of sacred names. The English translation, and we heard this, Nathan, I think, earlier, I am that I am, of Exodus 3:14, in no ways conveys what the Greek implies. But why should our naming be of any consequence to that which surpasses every name? Naming is all from our side, and what is from our side amounts to nothing. We are beholden to our names, which are only around God, as John of Damascus explains. John says, whatever we say about God cataphatically makes manifest not the nature, but what is around the nature. Whether you talk about goodness or justice or wisdom or anything else, you're talking not about God's nature, but what is around that nature. The frailty of names is clear from the fact that names we give to God are misnomers. God remains nameless and outside the category of naming. Cusa, in his learned ignorance, writes in his learned ignorance that oneness is the only name for God, but qualifies it by saying, I quote, it is not the case that oneness is the name of God in the way in which we either name or understand oneness. For just as God transcends all understanding, so a fortiori, he transcends every name. And of course, if we return to the Neoplatonists, we can find many examples of this ineffability of the one. I just give you one from Plotinus. He writes, to call the one a cause is to attribute an accident not to it, but to ourselves, because we gain something from it by calling it a cause, while it remains in itself. In fact, we should not say it or is if we are to be accurate. It is rather as if we circled round it on the outside in our desire to interpret our own experience, on some occasions coming close to it, on others falling back because of our perplexities about it. I think that really sums up Plotinus' thinking on this issue, which is so close to what Cusa is trying to express here in there. So we look at Cusa's Apophaticism. As we've mentioned, Cusa was familiar with the Latin works of Meister Eckhart, which he collected and annotated, as well as those of Dionysius and John Scotus. All these authors, in one way or another, contributed to his Christian Neoplatonic worldview. He writes in On Learning Ignorance, the theology of negation is so necessary to the theology of affirmation that without it God would not be worshipped as the infinite God, but as a creature. And such worship is idolatry, for it gives to an image that which belongs only to truth itself. The idea that idolatry is the worship of creation rather than the creator has a long history in Judeo-Christian thought. What we affirm about God may give a false impression because our affirmations are merely human projections and so diminishes divine glory. Even to say that he is absolute power still attempts to contain him within a human idea of what constitutes power, for we've no idea what our divine power is like. We have only analogies that hint at it, But we must not mistake those analogies as encompassing the truth. We need to recognize that cataphatic statements are only one side of the coin. For Cusa, the human mind or intellect is without measure or quantity, being absolute in its capacity to comprehend and form ideas and concepts. He writes, "For when you attend to the fact that the mind is a certain absolute measure that cannot be greater or smaller, since it is not restricted to quantity, and when you attend to the fact that this measure is alive, so that it measures by itself, as if a living compass were to measure by itself, then you grasp how it makes itself into a concept, it measures, it's an exemplar, and so on." I think this is very interesting from a lot of points of view. So because Cusa is saying the human mind is unquantifiable and thus indicative of its nearness to infinity, and of course for him ultimately to something beyond itself. This may be identified with the ground or spark spoken of by Eckhart, who treated it as the divine within us. For Cusa, there is something remarkable about the human mind being immeasurable, while at the same time being limited in its capacity to grasp the ultimate truth. It represents another of the paradoxes which are for him part of the human condition. Each of us lives with our own infinitude, and yet we are frustrated by it as much as liberated by it. This is confirmed by Plotinus. If we go back to him, he says, "The soul or mind, reaching towards the formless, finds itself incompetent to grasp where nothing limits it, or to gain an impression of where the impinging reality is extended. In sheer dread of holding on to nothingness, it slips away." So we've got this dread thing here, which is right going back to our Neoplatonists here. Cusa recognizes that the freedom the mind gives us also imposes a moral obligation to act in accordance with the divine ground that supports it. Sorry. I'll just take some water.
We're about sort of 10 or so minutes.
15 minutes, I think. We started, yeah. There's no doubt that Cusa was influenced by the Eastern Christian notion of deification, because he often refers to it by the Greek term, theosis. In his work on being a son of God, he makes the following remark: "To put my view summarily, I judge that being a son of God is to be regarded as nothing other than deification, which in Greek is called theosis. I do not think that we become sons of God in such a way that we will then be something essentially other than we are now. Instead, then we will be in another manner, that in which now we are in our present manner." So for Cusa, sonship or filiation means that what we are now will be different from what we will become by deification, only in a manner we cannot envisage or conceive. This sonship is a transformation into the likeness of God. It is not a transubstantiation into the divine essence in the sense that Eckhart wants to give it. Furthermore, sonship is limited to our present state. I quote, "And since this filiation is the ultimate of all power, our intellectual faculty is not exhaustible this side of deification, nor does it attain that which is ultimate perfection at any level this side of the stillness of sonship's perpetual life and eternal joy." Yet, despite retaining the idea of sonship to the individual believer, Cusa comes near to endorsing an adoptionist position regarding the sonship of Christ. He says Christ has a double sonship, being the Son of God by nature and a Son of God by adoption. However, this could mean speaking of two sons, which might be misconstrued as heresy. There was an adoptionist controversy in the 8th century involving Alcuin of York, and another in the 12th century involving Peter of Lombard, which Cusa must undoubtedly have been aware of. There are not two hypostases in Christ, the pre-existent Logos, a divine and a human, only one, the divine. This must be the case if the logic of the Trinity is to be safeguarded, otherwise there would be two sons, making it a quaternity, not a trinity. Just as with Eckhart, we find the in quantum qualifier at work in Cusa as well. This qualifying term shows the dependency of humanity in creation on the divine will. The divine gaze, which encompasses everything, continues to focus on the individual creature, no matter how unworthy. He says, "For I exist only in as much as, in quantum, you are with me. And since your seeing is your being, and therefore because you regard me, I am, and if you remove your face from me, I will cease to be." God is not lessened or diminished by the act of creation. On the contrary, creation participates in God through eminence. For Cusa, God is not aliud, that is, he is not other in the created realm, which is nothing per se because it is derivative and owes everything to its creator. Now, Cusa struggles on occasion to maintain the distinction between transcendence and immanence because he does not really want to separate them in his unifying vision of the coincidence of opposites. And of course, accusations of pantheism were levelled at him by one Johannes Wenck, who in his rebuttal on learned ignorance quotes Eckhart condemned Article 10 on deification that I quoted already. It was Wenck's rebuttal that gave rise to Cusa's own apology for unlearned ignorance. So you can see that Cusa is getting into trouble with some of his fellow theologians. Wenck was strongly Aristotelian and he didn't like the way Cusa was expressing his things. So I'd like to finish on a particular idea in Cusa. And this is the idea of divine contraction. And it's the idea that the infinite God self-contracts to make room for the finite creation. It involves God withdrawing into himself to make a creative space in which creation can coexist. The question centers on how the infinite can give rise to the finite, the uncreated to the created, the eternal to the temporal, the universal to particular, and so on. The notion of divine contraction was already on the database of Christian thinking. This is the idea of kenosis, that is, the self-emptying of Christ in order to take on humanity. The topic is found in Philippians 2:7, where it says, "He emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of humankind." It is this kenosis, or self-emptying of Christ's own will, to become receptive to the divine will that actualizes his incarnation. However, this act of emptying does not diminish his divinity nor magnify his humanity, because he is said to be fully human and fully divine. What Cusa appears to have done is to transfer the concept of kenosis from Christology to cosmogony. Hitherto, the idea was used in relation to the person of Christ, not in relation to the formation of the world. The space for the human in the divine has now become the space for creation. Perhaps Cusa is pursuing a more Eastern Christian approach to the concept of kenosis here. While the idea of divine self-emptying may be understood in a broader sense to include the creation of the cosmos, Christ, as the second person of the Trinity, is said to be part of creation from the beginning. The use of the first person plural rather than the first person singular in Genesis 1:26, let us make, was given a Trinitarian interpretation by Christian authors, meaning that humanity was made in the image and likeness of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In Jewish thought, as we found yesterday, divine wisdom, Chokmah, was associated with God at the creation of the world, while in Eastern Christianity, divine wisdom, Sophia, as we mentioned yesterday, became an attribute of Christ. This attribute given to Christ, by the way, is a very only Eastern Christian tradition. You never find it in the Western tradition. Christ is never referred to as wisdom. And the Sophia, of course, is feminine. So it has a very special way that it's used in an Eastern Christian context. John the theologian gave prominence to the relationship between creation and Christology when he writes, of course, "In the beginning was the Word." That is, Christ, the pre-existent Logos, was there at the world's inception, being referred to as the firstborn of all creation. Now, the only earlier witness to the idea of a cosmic contraction known to me is Moderatus of Gades, modern Cadiz in Spain. He was a neo-Pythagorean of the 1st century CE who conceived of a triadic one, or monad, as a self-contracting deity. He's said to have taught that this self-contraction gives rise to quantity that is itself shapeless, undifferentiated, formless, much like Plato's empty receptacle in the Timaeus, but which is receptive of form, shape, and distinction. By withdrawing into himself, the one creates the necessary conditions under which the paradigms of form, shape, distinction, and the rest can operate. The theory is reported by some Neoplatonists, but it does not appear to have gained much traction. So it's interesting to know where perhaps Cusa got this idea. Now, much of this is reminiscent to me of Isaac Luria's Zimtzum, a divine contraction, an idea developed by him in his study of the Kabbalah in the 16th century. As taught by Luria, God contracts into himself to make room for the creation of the world. He begins the process of creation, contracting his infinity to allow finite things to exist. This contraction forms what? A vacant space, like the formlessness and void before the creation of light in Genesis 1:2, perhaps. Without this restrictive space, nothing would exist, the world being the contracted likeness of God. It is a way of explaining how the world exists if the creator is infinite, but creation is finite. Now, the Lurianic and Cusanian contraction allows for differentiation, for opposites to exist, limited as opposed to unlimited, imperfect to perfect, immanent to transcendent, and so on. And it implies that outside of our limited notions of time and space, no such dimensions can exist, or they might do from what Nathan was saying about infinity earlier on. And there's just one German theologian who's taken up this idea. This was Jürgen Moltmann in his God in Creation, published in 1982, and he takes this Kabbalistic notion and actually uses it. But I don't think, as far as I found out so far, and I need to do more work, that Moltmann actually knew Cusa's use of this notion of contraction. I think he's got it from the Isaac Luria. Well, he says he has. So, just very briefly in conclusion. What I've tried to show in this paper is that the twin pillars of speculative theology in Eckhart and Cusa, Apophaticism and Deification, are essential elements of their approach to understanding the nature of the divine. Although I've referred to these terms as two sides of the same coin, we might venture to identify Apophaticism with nothingness and Deification with being, but the implications of saying this will need to be investigated further. I've deliberately avoided the term mysticism. I'm sure you've noticed I haven't used the word mystic at all, because I think it detracts from our appreciation of their legacy. Not that I think religious experience is absent from their lives, on the contrary, it is essential to the development of their ideas, but I think the term misses the essential nature of their contribution, which is highly speculative, both metaphysically and theologically. And of course, I've tried to show historically that both sailed close to the wind as far as the ecclesiastical authorities of the time were concerned. But thankfully, we've still got their works to enjoy and look at. But let's finish on a cartoon. He identified as a person with no identity, a nobody, a nothing, a strange non-entity. He wasn't quite the average bloke. He was beyond belief and beyond a joke, blank and hollow like an empty space, with a vacant smile upon his face, and a faraway look in his haunted eyes, which made you think he might be wise. An insightful genius with nothing dim. In fact, there were many who identified with him and said he was cool and deep and amazing, but said nothing and went on gazing at the sky, the floor, the wall, trying to think of nothing at all. Thank you.
Just a couple of quick questions.
Yeah, we're just 5 minutes.
Okay,
out.
great.
Yeah, this morning I asked what it means to say that all things are one. I want to ask a similar question. I mean, you quoted some of these people as saying that God is one, and I want to know exactly what that means. You know, these cups are two,
Yes.
this cup is
Yeah.
one, they don't mean that.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to say that God is one?
I think I'm going to have to give the same answer that I really don't know ultimately. Right? I mean, we talk about one, we talk about monism, we talk about Trinitarianism, we talk about all sorts of things that we want to put a label on here. It obviously works in some way for people who use this sort of language, but whether it works for everybody in terms of of how they might understand it, interpret it, it's not the case, because obviously. Maybe it goes back to some of the things that you were saying about how you identify with something that is clearly not you, but is you in some way. You know, I don't know. I mean, one of the problems with this is this question I think you raised earlier about pantheism. I think you might have mentioned that, or somebody did. And it's always been a problem for these two thinkers in terms of, from a doctrinal point of view or from a strictly orthodox point of view, is how are we going into pantheism when we should, as in a Christian context, not be going down that particular way. These guys didn't seem to be bothered too much about it, really. I mean, they took this idea out of a Neoplatonic context. It was then perpetuated by people like Dionysius, by John Scotus. I mean, it's just amazing, in a way, that this sort of talk continued to go the way that it did. And occasionally somebody might want to stop it, but really they couldn't. They liked the way that this is how you describe things. Now, whether I understand what they're saying, I think is a different issue, really. I really wouldn't like to say at the end of the day, but for them, clearly, it is something that is packed with meaning. We try to unpack it in some way, but maybe we don't have the experiences that they had that brought them to be able to express it in that way. I think that's all I can say, Graham.
But whatever it means, it seems to be incompatible with Apophaticism because it's positive.
Yes, you're right. And I don't think somebody like Cusa would be able to say no to that. But that's the paradox.
But he explicitly denies the principle of non-contradiction.
Well, they want him. That's what they're arguing against him, that he's going against the law of non-contradiction.
Well, if I remember right, on Learned Ignorance, he actually attacked Aristotle.
Yes, yes.
So he does deny the principle of non-contradiction.
Yeah, but then the Aristotelians come back at him and saying, you know, you're doing all the wrong things anyway. I'm thinking about it in the wrong way.
I'm sure he'd agree.
Yes, yeah. I mean, what do you do? I mean, these guys are off on their own trajectory, and it's great to go along with them, but if you want to stop and say there are some limits to what they're doing here, then you're coming from a different position, aren't you, with it? So, you know, it's...
For me, you mentioned Augustine. To me, the logic which he follows and doesn't take that final leap.
Yes.
Right. And to me, God is one denies the theism, where God must be God and
It denies theism, I think.
Well, I think Harvey is the Sufi poet says he laughs at two. Well, God, if you see God in a separate way to creation,
Yeah.
you know, vertical commas, then you do have a problem. It can't be resolved. But if you see God as an all, then that's the resolution. And I think that Eckhart and Cusa, they both were trying to balance, theism and, well, kind of pantheism.
Yeah, you can look at all these isms are, I'm not sure they get us anywhere at the end of the day, really. But yeah, I mean, these two thinkers are so creative in what they're doing. I mean, it's. I wish we had some of modern philosophers, naming none, which were as creative as these two are in terms of what they're trying to do metaphysically, is astonishing. But yeah.
Okay, I'm going to skip your question, Paul, because I want to sort of get vaguely back on track.
Yes.
Quite a few
Yeah.
talks to go. Thanks.